Warm good morning to all. Welcome to the last day of our faculty development program in Behavioural Economics, organized by the Department of Economics, St. Berchmans College, Chennai, Kerala, India. Today also, we have Junofy Anto Rozarina of University of Zurich, Switzerland, with yet another topic, Behavioural Economics in Public Policy. Welcome, ma'am.
Great, so welcome back everyone, and welcome to the last session of this program. Today we're going to be talking about behavioral economics and how it's applicable in public policy. So basically, we'll be looking at a lot of field experiments, so you will get a little bit of idea on how it looks like and how to run a field experiment. So let's start with why behavioral economics is extremely important for public policy. So as you know, a lot of government policies are based on research, and this research is often from the field of economics or other social sciences, but with the assumption that people are payoff maximizers. And we clearly saw in the past few days how that's not true. We are not payoff maximizers. We do care about our payoffs, but we also care about a lot of other things. We have other social constraints. We have bad calculation of time, and we have bad calculation of probability when it comes to risks and so on. And if we want really good policies, then we need policies which take into account the fact that people are not rational, right? So this is where behavioral economics becomes extremely important for public policy, and we will today see how this can be done, like how can behavioral economics be used in public policy. So these are all like nudge units around the world. There's also like much more. There's also one that started up in India. So these are all government nudge units. So these nudge units are just organizations which are specifically designed to help governments with policy formation using insights of behavioral economics. So before we go there, let's just quickly see what we saw so far. We saw how behavioral economic we learned about various behavioral economics concepts. We also learned about how experiments are conducted, which as I told you, is both of those sessions. Like those sessions, the first 3 sessions are sort of the base for the whole course. And yesterday we saw a lot of examples of lab experiments. And today we'll see a lot of real life experiments, which could include natural experiment or field experiment, which I'll explain in a little bit. Before we proceed, I just want to introduce one other concept, which I think is important when you look at experiments, and it's called mechanism. So mechanism just refers to the path that happens when some causal relationship is present. So for example, let's say when somebody gets hungry, they feel uncomfortable. So the mechanism would just be that when somebody gets hungry, the stomach produces a lot of acids, and these acids irritate the stomach, and therefore they feel uncomfortable. So the mechanism just means that what is the path that you took? So to get from location A, which is usually our independent variable, to location B, which is the dependent variable, what is the path that we took, right? So this is called mechanism, and whatever comes in between, all the stops in between in the path. For example, when I said stomach produces acid, so that's one of the stop, and these stops are called mediator variables. So these variables are just variables that are present in a mechanism between the 2 variables of interest. So let's look at another example. And we sort of know that if you consume a lot of street food, your health sort of worsens, at least in the short term. So why don't you just try to come up with mediator variables? So what do you think could be a mediator variable here? So we know that street food makes your health bad, but what could be mediator variables? So the thing is, there isn't never one mediator variable. There's always like numerous number of mediator variables. So maybe you could just give some examples in the chat of what mediator variables you think could have an effect there. So this is just the one causal relationship. Let me show you some examples that I've put in here. So again, we always have the independent variable here and the dependent variable on the corner. You see this poor health here. And there could be a lot of mechanisms, right? This is one mechanism. So because of increase in oil consumed, the cholesterol level in blood increases and therefore there's poor health. Or it could be that the person in the street food usually has unhealthy ingredients and therefore indigestion and then poor health. It could be that because it's in the street, it could be that you intake some microbes and therefore you get some infection and therefore you have poor health, right? So there's a lot of things that can happen. So there's a lot of people who have given lots of examples as well. So some talk about infections, some basically talk about other stomach problems that you could get, indigestion and so on. So there could be multiple mediators in between mechanisms. So here we have 2 in between, so there can be 10, there can be 1, right? So these are mediator variables and this is what mechanism is. And I'll give you another example which is closer to behavioral science. So this is a very old research of mine. So here what I tried to find out was we created a fake election, a lab experiment. There's a small election there. So there are these candidates who are trying to get some votes. And there are these voters who can vote for the candidate that they like. But to pick which candidate they like, they need to get some information, right? Otherwise, you're just indifferent towards multiple candidates. So before the election starts, candidates can make promises about what they will do after the election. So this is very similar to real life. And as we see, promises have a direct impact on which candidate the person chooses. So whichever candidate promises more gets chosen much more often. And we obviously know that from real life as well. And if you look at the mediator variable, there's a change in the belief. So when someone makes a promise, you believe that the person would actually stick to the promise. And research shows that people actually stick to the promises that they make, even if not completely, like they partially stick to it. And here we change the mechanism a bit. So if you see, this is like exactly the same as this. But here now we introduce something called the election gift. So in a lot of states in India, as you know, the incumbent, the candidate who's in power, can also give an election gift to people before the election starts. So right before the election, they do a lot of things. For example, they quickly build some bridges, they quickly give some gifts, they give televisions, radios, or whatever. And these election gifts could have 2 impact on the mechanism. So one, it could help change the belief. And the other one, just because if someone gave you a gift, you tend to reciprocate by voting for them. So it's basically the concept of reciprocity that we already saw. So there's some questions. Are mediator variables always sequential? They don't have to be. So as you saw, like for example here, it's not even one straight line. So it can be like this. And if you look at this example, technically you can put all of this together, all of the end together, and there can be like multiple chains. So it's just like some sort of graph which shows this. But only important thing is that it should be unidirectional. So it shouldn't like be both directional. So just because you have high cholesterol in the blood, your oil consumption shouldn't increase basically. So it should just go in one direction. Okay, so we saw what external validity was. So external validity, just to recap, basically tells us how the results that you found in your experiment or your study is applicable for other experiments or other studies and other regions. And why is establishing a mechanism helpful in estimating the external validity? So let's just start with an example. So we know that if you don't wear a jacket or any proper winter clothing in the Everest base camp, you would die. But is this applicable in the other mountains as well? So there are Alps here. Do you think the same thing is applicable here? And I use this example because it's logically easy to imagine for us. So yeah, if you don't wear any winter protection, of course, you're going to freeze and die. So if you think about it, you clearly can draw out the mechanism. So what happens here? your body temperature goes really low, you get hypothermia and then you die, or you basically get frostbites and develops into infection and you die, and so on. So the mechanisms, when the mechanism is extremely clear, you can now say this is not just applicable in Everest, it's also applicable in any really tall, cold mountains. So now you know exactly what your external validity is. It's applicable in all cold mountains or really cold places, to be honest, not just mountains, right? And it's not applicable in warm places. So now you know exactly where it's applicable and where it's not. And you're able to do that only because you know the mechanism. Now let's take some other example from behavioral economics. So let's say people generally reciprocate. So when you give someone a gift, they help you back. And let's say we conduct this experiment in India. And how do we know if this is going to apply in the US as well? We don't know if this result would apply, right? So you really need to learn the mechanism. So if the mechanism is the strongest mechanism is culture, then maybe it's not going to be applicable in other places. So you need to identify these mechanisms, and it would really help us knowing what the external validity is. And talking about internal validity, so internal validity basically just talks about, is your result correct? So is this data correct for this particular subject that you're using? So let's take an issue that could be present. So it's called common cause principle. So if there are two variables that you're interested in, let's say you're interested in this treatment and outcome, and if there is an unobserved common cause, so let's say there's something that causes both, then you might think that there is a relationship, although there isn't. And to identify that there's a common cause, you need to try to find how the mechanism. Only then you can establish if it went through the mechanism or if there's something else that's affecting. We'll see an example here as well. So initially, when cigarette companies started selling cigarettes, they basically claimed that cigarette smoking does not cause cancer, and both craving for tobacco, which causes cigarette smoking, and lung cancer is commonly caused by a gene in the body. So they claimed that there was an unobserved cause, which is a gene, which makes people smoke more and also gives them lung cancer. So they said the cigarette is not the reason why smoking is causing lung cancer, but rather there is an unobserved cause. But so people try to find a mechanism with mediator variables so that they can show that there is actually a relationship there. And the way they found out is that as you start smoking, tar starts accumulating in your lungs, and accumulation of tar causes cancer. So now we established a mechanism, and now we know that this is internally valid. So this is how mechanisms are extremely useful in measuring internal validity as well as external validity. Great. So now let's look at some real-life examples of using a lot of field experiments and lab in the field experiments. And we'll basically try to see how this is applicable for policy. So let's start with this research. So this is a field experiment in Nigeria. And every time I put this is the authors, and this is the year when it was published. So this is usually the title of the paper as well. So if you want to look up the paper, you can just go to Google Scholar and put this in, and then you should find the research papers there. Anyway, so there was this conflict in Nigeria between, between Christians and Muslims. And usually the violent acts are caused by young boys. So what these researchers did was that they took some Christian and Muslim young boys and enrolled them in this program of a 16-week computer training course where people were just given training in computer science and how to use it. So what they tried to do is test something called the contact hypothesis. So the contact hypothesis just says that if two people have a fight, you put them together, make them do a lot of tasks together, and they somehow become friends in the end. So contact hypothesis just means that when you increase the contact between two conflicting sides, the conflict sort of dissolves. So this is how their treatment looked like. So for once they had no program treatment, which is basically the control group, and 550 people. So whatever number is here is the number of people there. So 300 people were in the control group, 550 people were in the program group. And inside the program, they divided it into two types of classrooms. So some classrooms were homogeneous, which means it was all Christian or all Muslim. And some classes were heterogeneous, which means they were like a sort of equal number of Christian and Muslim young boys in the class. And then they also had a partner. So people had to work in twos. So they were like broken down into groups of two people. And they had to do all the homeworks together. They had to use the same computer and so on. And obviously in the homogeneous class where there's just children of one religion, like students of one religion, all the partners were co-religious, which means they're from the same religion. So every Muslim kid was partnered with another Muslim kid, and every Christian kid was partnered with another Christian kid. And in the heterogeneous classroom, some students had co-religious partners, which means they were partnered with the same religion. Some children had non-co-religious partner, which means they were partnered with the opposite religion. And now they basically ran this 16-week computer training course with this sort of treatment. So some of them were in the same classroom with same religion and with the same religion partner. Some were in a mixed classroom but with the same religion. Some in a mixed classroom but with different religion. And at the end of it, they were trying to find out if these children still had biases, if they still treated the other religion differently, if they became closer, if they became, they started hating each other even more, and so on. So this is what they found out. They found out that heterogeneous classroom, which is the contact hypothesis treatment, where children of all religion, like both the religion, were learning together, did not reduce the amount of discrimination they had. So this treatment was exactly the same as control group, which means nothing really happened here. But what happened was, this group, the homogeneous classroom, started to discriminate children of other religion much more than every other group, basically. So this is actually interesting. So this did not prove contact hypothesis. This proved something else. This showed that even though contact did not help, lack of contact basically made people discriminate much more. So this is what the study is. And someone just asked a question. Is it not necessary to have equal sample size and treatment and control group? No, you don't have to have the same sample size and treatment and control group. If you think about it, this is a treatment group, this is a treatment group, and this is a treatment group. And you just don't have to compare this and this. You need to go to the lowest levels here. And basically, you just calculate the power that you need to get a significant result, and use the power calculation to find the sample size to get a significant result, and then that's the minimum number you need. And apart from that, if you have little excess money, you can basically put more people as well. And generally, the control treatment is much cheaper to conduct, so it's common to put more people in the control group because it's just cheaper. So someone asked another question: what's the difference between lab in the field, and field experiments? And we sort of already covered it. So lab experiment is somewhere where you just have student subjects or subjects who are not relevant to the exact research question. Lab in the field is when you have relevant subjects, but it's not in the real life scenario. And field experiment is when you have relevant subject and also you are in the real life scenario. And another question was, what about cases where there is bidirectional relationship? I think you're referring to the mechanism. We basically do not include bidirectional relationship in mechanism just because we are interested in causal relationship and not in correlation there. Okay, great. So let's move on. So this is one of the very interesting research that I found. And this is again something related to voter turnout. So we spoke about one voting example when we spoke about spillovers, about how people putting lawn signs in one city also affected people in the neighboring regions. This is another way of increasing voter turnout. So these people, Gerber and Green, they both generally conduct a lot of experiments. They did a lot of research with respect to voter turnouts. So this is a very interesting field experiment in the US. And this was only possible because in the US, the data, if somebody voted or not, is publicly available. So you can basically look anyone up and see if they took part in the election or not. So this is what they did. They have 5 different groups. So the first group is control group. So they don't say anything. They just see if this person took part in the election or not. And in the second group, they send them a letter which says, please vote in the election. It's your civic duty. You need to take part in elections so that you get a good government and so on. So this is the civic duty treatment. And there was a Hawthorne treatment, and Hawthorne basically means that there's an effect with this name. It basically just means that when you're looking at somebody in an experiment, they know that you're looking at them and therefore they behave slightly differently. So for example, if you just let people in the wild and then ask them if they give charity, money for charity, the number of people who give money for charity is very different from when you put them in a lab and then ask them, are you going to give this money for charity? Because just because of so many multiple behavioral reasons, we tend to act very differently when we know somebody is watching us. So in this treatment, the people just got a letter saying, listen, we are conducting this study, so we will be looking at your voting data, but we will not disturb you anymore, we will not contact you, so yeah, have a nice day. So this was the other treatment. And the most interesting are these 2 treatments. So in the self-treatment, the people got a letter which showed them basically this data. So this is the neighbor treatment, but we can still look at self-treatment here. So it basically put the names of everyone in their family, and it showed them if they voted in August 2004 election, in November 2004 election, in August. So this is the election that's coming up. So it basically showed if they voted in the previous elections. And it told them that after this election is over, the new election is over, we will send you back a letter with more information which tells if you voted or not. So here you're not shamed publicly, but you're basically told that you will be looking at your own data. And this is the most interesting data, and it's been like questioned ethically a lot. However, because data is publicly available in the US, it's ethically acceptable. So what they did here was, this is the neighbors treatment. This is the most interesting one according to me. Here they sent them the data of all their neighbors, so everyone who lives around them, and told them if they voted in the previous elections. And also told that your neighbors are also getting this information about you, and they will again get another letter which tells them if you voted in this next election. So they're basically using social norms, they're using pressure from society to push people to take part in elections. And this is what we observe. This is the results. So in control group, around 30% of people took part in elections. When they were told about the civic duty, 31.5% took part in the elections. When they were said that they were being observed, a little more took part in the elections. When people got their own data, 34% of people took part in elections. And the neighbors treatment got 38% people taking part in the election. So you can see how the number increases. And you should know that increasing the voter turnout is extremely hard. Just changing 1 percentage point is a huge deal. And these people were able to increase the percentage like really drastically because of public naming and shaming, basically. And if you just think about it, like all of these experiments are extremely applicable from a policy perspective, right? So if you want to, like governments always like try to come up with policies which increases voter turnout. And for example, in Switzerland, there is a particular canton. So canton is like a district. And in that canton, if people do not take part in elections, they need to pay a small fine. And so there are like various ways to push people to take part in elections. And this is one of the ways that Gerber and Green found, Gerber, Green, and Larimer found, and which worked quite well. Okay, so let's move on. So this is the next study we're going to talk about. So this is called Lies in Disguise. And this is another interesting study. So here, what the subjects are asked to do is to roll a die. So they're basically given a die and they're asked to, in a very secluded location where others cannot see, and they roll the dice and they put the number that comes up on a piece of paper. So let's say I roll 5, I just write 5 in the paper. And I could technically lie because nobody can see what number I wrote there. So I could put whatever number I want. And this is what was the payoff. So whatever number I get, sorry, this is wrong. It's actually the reported number minus 1, not 1 minus the reported number. So whatever number I get, I'll earn €1 less than that. So if I get 6, I'll get €5. If I get 1, I get €0. If I get 4, I get €3. So basically, the bigger the number I give, the more the money I get. So, and also nobody can see that I'm lying because it's hidden in the dice. So let's assume that nobody lied. How do you think the results would have looked? Like how many people would have reported 1, how many people would have reported 2, and so on. And since we know that dice is like, it's supposed to have 1/6 probability to get each of the numbers in the die. So every side should basically get equal chance of coming up. So if you draw a graph there, it should look something like this. It should be like every number should have equal probability. So the graph would look something like this. But what do you think the actual results were? Like, what do you think people lied there? Do you think people did not lie? Do you think it would have gone up like this? Because as you go here, you earn much more money than when you're here. So do you think more people would have lied? Yeah. So someone just guessed that maximum number of people would have lied. So since you cannot get caught doing this, rationally it makes sense to just lie. And irrational economic man does not have guilt, does not have any sort of these social constraints or conscience. So if we were following rational theory, everyone would have said 6 and no one would have said anything else. So this is how it would have been if we are rational. If we were honest, everyone would have said the same number. That said, this is how the results looked. So this is 5, which means people reported 6 here. These people reported 1. So it's actually interesting that 6.4% of people were definitely honest. They said that they rolled a 1 and got 0 payoff. But it's really interesting how this graph goes up, right? It's like most people definitely lied because it's not straight. And this methodology is really interesting because you cannot see if each person lied. You cannot say this person lied. So there is like no fear of getting caught or whatever. But on an overall level, you can say, yes, people have lied in this group, right? So just because of the distribution. I'm just looking at the questions. Okay, let's move on. And there's another research which a professor from JNU has conducted, but he hasn't published it. But to give you a quick overall idea of what it looks like, he gave the participants 10 puzzles and asked them to solve it. So each puzzle you solve, you earn 10 rupees. So overall, you can earn 100 rupees if you solve all 10 puzzles. And the interesting thing here is that the puzzles are not solvable. So you actually cannot solve any of the puzzles. You are supposed to report 0. You're supposed to say, I did not solve anything. That's the truth. But what he did was, he told them, solve the puzzles, and we'll show you the answers on the screen, and just correct your own paper and let's say you got 3 correct or 4 correct or 10 correct, just when you leave the experiment room, just tell us how many you got correct and we'll pay you accordingly. And as you can imagine, people lied a lot. A lot of people gave non-zero numbers, which basically means that they were lying, because you should technically just get 0. So people gave various numbers saying I solved 7 and got 70 rupees and so on. Okay, so let's go on. Maybe we could take a quick break here. Let's take a 5-minute break. And I'll see you back in 5 minutes then. And obviously, if you have some questions, then you can just ask here. All right, so let's start again. I'll start with going through the questions and answering some of them. So someone asked, in what ways can we nudge people to wear a mask and maintain physical distance? So there's a lot of research going on right now about it. And as I showed you the other day, one of the way to push people to wear a mask and follow social distancing is to tell them it's not about them, it's about other people. So if you are going around without a mask, you're basically a bad person because you don't care about others, and that obviously really helps. And street every 1.5 meters itself seems to be working extremely well, even without anyone supervising. People tend to follow the lines, and yeah, ways like that is really helpful. Okay, and someone asked, at what stage of policy making is behavioral economics most crucial? Is it policy ideation or evaluation or both? And I would say both, because I mean, especially during the initial ideation phase, when you need to come up with a policy, it's good to use all these behavioral insights and design your policy. But of course, because your population is very specific, you should probably also use it during the evaluation phase and test if it actually works for your population. Okay, and someone asked a question about, is scheduled tribe students who have been given education by creating tribal schools create more prejudice and conflicts within them to interact with other communities? It sometimes happens, but giving a protected environment for certain people could be useful in certain scenarios. So it's very dependent on the particular scenario. Okay, so let's move on. Let's see a little more examples and then wrap up. So this is another example, and this is about the Hajj trip that Muslims take. And this study took place in Pakistan, and this is a natural experiment. So let me start with explaining what a natural experiment is. So natural experiment is where the experimenter, or the researcher, the one who's conducting the research, is not manipulating people into multiple treatments. So let's say I am an experimenter. I shouldn't be putting people into treatment and control group. It should be happening automatically due to some other reasons. Could be natural, or could be due to the government deciding it, and so on. And this is usually the case. For instance, if you're trying to study how people's behavior changes due to an earthquake, it's a natural experiment because your treatment is basically people who face an earthquake, and you did not decide where the earthquake or who gets affected, right? So it's a natural experiment. And in the same way, here in Pakistan, this is a very interesting case. Just the initial part itself is extremely interesting because Pakistan allocates Hajj visa. So that's the visa from the government, which helps people go on this Hajj trip using a lottery. So any number of people can apply for it, but they only have a specific number of visas that they provide using the government. So this is like the cheaper visa. People can also get the more expensive private one, but this is like much cheaper. And it's allocated by lottery. So whoever applies, the government just puts them all in a lottery and selects who gets successful, in which case they get a visa, and who's unsuccessful, and therefore they did not get a visa. So if you think about it, these people are extremely similar, those successful people and unsuccessful people, because they were all interested in going on the Hajj trip. They all applied, they all got into the lottery, but using a probability, some of them were successful, some of them were unsuccessful. This is like perfect randomization, but using a natural experiment. And the researchers were interested in knowing. So there's a lot of claim that going on a Hajj trip makes people much more religious and so on. So this is exactly what they were interested in studying. Was interested in studying if it actually does that, because now we have a nice experimental setting. And this is what they found. So they saw that participation in Hajj increased people's observance of global Islamic practices. So there are these practices which are religious, but in a global scale, like praying at like 5 times a day or fasting and so on. And it increased that participation. So people began to do that much more. But it also decreased participation in localized practices and beliefs, such as use of amulets and dowry. So amulets is like this charm, dollars or something, which is supposed to give you good luck. And that's not a global phenomenon. And dowry is not a global phenomenon. It's a very location-specific phenomenon, which apparently went down. Because why do you think this happened? The researchers claim that this should have happened because now all this time they were just interacting with other Pakistani Muslims, but now they got to interact with Muslims from all countries, like from Europe, from the US, from all over the world. So somehow they got exposure to a lot of new culture and basically decreased their participation in localized practices and increased their participation in global practices. And I haven't added it here, but one of the other results of the study is also that the participants who went on the Hajj trip thought that women should have better rights, women should have equal say in the family and so on. And again, I think this is because they stepped out of their culture and basically looked at other Muslims from other countries which have better situation for women, basically. So here the exposure has somehow affected people to change their behavior in this way. And another interesting thing here that you need to look at is, you remember how we discussed about non-compliance, where people in the treatment group might not take the treatment, the people in the control group might take the treatment. And here they removed people who applied for Hajj, got the Hajj visa, but could not go to Hajj. So there was no non-compliance in the treatment group, but in the control group, people who did not get, who were unsuccessful in the lottery, sometimes they also applied for the private visa and they paid more and went on the Hajj trip. So there is partial, like there's non-compliance in the control group because the control group also sometimes got the treatment. The treatment was going on the Hajj trip. So, right, so the mechanism is just that they got exposure to other Hajjis from around the world. Great, so I'll just quickly see if there's some question here. In contact hypothesis, even if it leads to less prejudice and discrimination, that will be limited to individual opinion and wouldn't necessarily lead to social acceptance. So the earlier contact hypothesis that we were talking about is just between two people or like two groups. So to give you a quick example, so there was this, I forgot the name of the place, but this is a camp where earlier times when Catholics and Protestants did not have a great interaction with each other, the camp there was a Catholic camp and there was a Protestant camp really close to each other, and kids from both the camp would just fight with each other. They were like really, really young kids, and they never liked each other. So what the experimenters did was they initially created competitions between them. So they said, you play football and you play against each other, for instance. And every time, because they kept fighting against each other, they started hating each other even more. So that's also technically contact. They're still in contact with each other, but that's not going to help, right? And later, the experimenters created some fake water problem and told them that both the camps is not going to get water unless they repair something together and everybody sort of work together, and clearly the prejudice, the discrimination between each other decreased. So yes, contact hypothesis actually works. And there's also another theory, there's also another research about caste system and cricket in India. So people from different castes used to discriminate each other, but when they were put together in a cricket team and asked to play together, somehow the discrimination went down drastically. Is experimental economics and behavioral economics practically applicable for a country like India? I think it's extremely applicable for a country like India. In fact, like more applicable for a country like India than Western countries, because in India we have a lot of social norms. We have a lot of these behavioral factors which are extremely different and extremely under-researched. So yes, it's extremely applicable. Okay. Great. So someone asked if there was an underestimation of the treatment effect. Yes. In the Hutch treatment, yes, there would have been a small underestimation of the treatment effect. Great. So let's move on to this study. So this is about ethnic discrimination in German labor market. And so here what they did was they took a lot of advertisements in the newspaper. So they took 528 advertisements in the newspaper, and these advertisements were for student internships. And they created 2 fake applications. So one application had a Turkish sounding name. So just to give you a background, in Germany, there's a lot of Turkish immigrants. And so one name was very Turkish and the other name was a German sounding name. So they created 2 applications. Both of them seemed extremely strong and good enough, like equally good. And they sent these applications to all these internships. And what they were trying to see is when people write back to them, is the German person getting more responses than the Turkish sounding person, although the application is very similar. And do you think there was a difference, or do you think both the students were treated similarly? Because everything was similar. They had similar education, similar credentials, similar experience, and so on. Different or same? So this is the result. If you have the German name, increased the probability of getting a callback by 14% on an average overall. So having a German name did help. If it was a smaller firm, there was actually 24% more callback. So there was more unknowing discrimination in smaller firms. And another interesting part of the study was when the application came with some recommendation letters, this number went down. So recommendation letters do help in reducing the prejudice that people have. And there's a lot of these studies that takes place, and these are like very interesting as well, because this is a nice field experiment and you're sending real applications and real people are looking at it, and you basically get the real actual data. And yeah, and this discrimination can also be observed in India, for instance, between states or between castes and so on, and religion as well. These are all again under the clause of in-group, out-group bias that we discussed. So people always tend to favor in-group, the same group, and tend to not favor so much the out-group. And although most of us would disagree to that, we would always say that we treat everyone equal. That's not the case. So even if you don't know about it, we have these inherent biases, which, as I explained earlier, are evolutionarily explained. So it's not inherently a bad thing unless, but we need to make sure that we don't have these biases, basically. Okay, so moving on. This is another interesting research that is really, really well spoken about. So it's called Save More Tomorrow program. And this is to increase the retirement savings. So when people are working, they need to save some money for future. And what happens is that people, we lack self-control. So often, instead of putting the money in savings, we end up buying an extra, whatever, clothing or phone or whatever, or go on an extra trip, or just spend the money with friends or whatever. So this is really not good, because people always want to save more, but they don't save enough. And this is especially the case in Western societies. In India, we do save quite a lot, but in Western societies, it's a case that people don't save enough. And before we move on to what the study was, I'll just give you like a little bit of recap on certain concepts. You probably learned this in Ashish's class, but let's just quickly look at it. So present bias basically means that whatever is good or nice to us, we try to have it as soon as possible, and whatever is painful, we try to push it forward to a later date. Loss aversion basically means that we don't like loss, and I remember there was this graph, I hope you remember too. So this is like gains, so this is earning more money, this is gains, and this is the loss, and the graph looks something like this. So basically this is how much pain you get because of this loss, and this is how much happiness you get because of this gain. And the amount of happiness you get is not that big, but the amount of pain you get when you lose something is really big. And this is loss aversion. And the status quo bias basically means that whatever is the default, we stick to it. And you also saw an example of how organ donation has an effect. Like there was an organ donation example which used the status quo bias to increase the number of organ donors signing up. Okay, this said, let's see what the Save More Tomorrow program is. So this is this is given by the employer. And what happens is that you don't have to save more today. So you just keep your current retirement savings. But in the future, in case you get some sort of bonus or some sort of pay rise, then with that extra money, you save more. So what they do is currently we like to spend all our money. So they're not asking anyone to save more right now. They just say you save more in the future, and we all say, I'm going to study tomorrow, I'm going to exercise from tomorrow, so on, right? But we don't want to do that today. And that's exactly the bias that they're using. So you don't have to save more today, but save more in the future. And they also tell them that you don't have to lose any salary in the future, but any bonus or pay rise that you get would be the money that will be contributing to the retirement savings. So you don't have to worry about it. Therefore, they avoided the loss aversion feeling. And when people enrolled, they told them that they would remain in the program forever until they opt out of it. And as you know, we are all lazy, so we never opt out of programs. And therefore, they use this status quo bias. Another example of status quo bias is when we sign up for magazines and newsletters or newspapers. And even if you don't stop using it, we often have this buffer period of time when we just keep getting the newspaper but not reading it, but still paying for it. Only after a long time we realize how much money we lost and then sign out of it. So this is status quo bias. And they sort of used all of these three behavioral biases for the benefit of this program. And it worked amazingly well. So people saved much, much more after they signed up for this program. Before we move on, let me just look at some questions. And is it useful in economically analyzing loss of land, either civil or criminal? It depends on which law you're analyzing, but yes, it can be extremely useful. Okay, sorry. We are planning to organize an online investment game, 6 months long, to study about the influence of cognitive dissonance on investor behavior. The game is planned with a good prize money. Yeah, it is an acceptable methodology as long as you have proper randomization in case there is multiple treatments and so on. Okay, great. So let's move on. So let's talk about some Indian story now. So this is about education in India. And as we know Duflo and Banerjee now, and these are a few other co-authors who did these studies with them. So this is about two different research studies that they did. And the first one is called Remedial Education Program, and it took place in Mumbai. Here, young women from the same community basically taught very basic literacy and number skills, so basically a little bit of math and a little bit of language, to children who are lagging behind in government schools. So they went to government schools, took the children who were performing badly in school, and they found these women who would teach them the basic math and language skills. And as you can imagine, it increased the test score in the first year and also much more in the second year. So it did have a positive impact compared to the control group. And a lot of these studies, if you think about it, it seems extremely intuitive. It's like, yes, if you give extra training to badly performing children, of course, the test score is going to increase, right? And what's the point of this study? Like, why are they even doing it? And sometimes the reason why people do these research is to give specific numbers, that helps in policy. For instance, if we all know that giving an extra class to children who are struggling in school helps them, but that is not good enough for a policy to be implemented, right? You need these numbers to show return on investment for policies to happen, and for that these research is like extremely useful. And the other study that they did was computer assisted learning program. So here all students, so this is not just badly performing students, so here all the students were given 2 hours of shared computer time per week. So in the computer they played various games which were educational and taught them like basic math skills. So it was like mathematical games that they played on the computer for 2 hours every week. And the math scores increased drastically. And this is like extremely strong result if you think about it. So giving people like a little bit of computer or math related games has helped people a lot. But of course, this is really expensive to scale across the country. But this research has been quite pioneering in the sense that it pushed a lot of policies in a lot of states to increase the computer labs and computer availability for students. Someone just said this is like the scholar support program in Kerala. I'm sorry, I don't know much about it, but I guess it's very similar. Okay, so the next one is about trust and religion. This study took place in rural Bangladesh. And again, in Bangladesh, there are Muslims and Hindu households. And the outcome we're interested in is trust. So when people of same religion are put together, do they trust each other much more than when people of two religion are put together? And I hope you remember the trust game from yesterday. Just to quickly recap, if I'm playing with you, I send you some amount of money, and whatever I send gets multiplied by some amount, let's say 3, and you get that amount, and with that you can send back whatever you want to me. So this is the trust game. And so basically they play this trust game with Muslims with Muslims, Hindus with Hindus, and Muslims with Hindus. So there are mixed groups and there are homogeneous groups. And this is the results that were found. And just remember, in Bangladesh, Hindus are the minority. And that said, let's begin. So both Hindus and Muslims were found to trust others from the same religion much more than they trust others from other religion. So people tend to trust people from the same religion much more. And you should think about the policy consequences here. So this also means that most social contracts work on trust. So when I lend money to my friend, or if I start a business with my friend, a lot of these things work on trust. And this also means that the interaction within religion is much higher than interaction between religion. And Hindus, which is the minority, tend to trust people much lesser in general. So the Hindus in the subject trusted people from same religion as well as other religions slightly lesser than Muslims. And the other result was that Hindus trusted Muslims more than the Muslims trusted Hindus. And the interesting part about this research is that although it talks about Hindus and Muslims, we should also look at this in the case of minority and the majority. So if you read it this way, minorities trust the majorities more than the majorities trust the minorities. So this is also possible. So we don't know exactly what the mechanism was, why people made this behavior. It could be because it was minority, majority. It could be because of some recent conflicts that happened, some recent news that happened, or it could actually be because of religion. So we need to keep that in mind while we read this research. Okay, I'll just quickly look through the questions again. How do we justify the negative criticisms against field experiments? It's expensive and time consuming. Field experiments are expensive and time consuming, but also they are more relevant to real life. So in that case, they're extremely useful. And if you are doing some policy testing for the government, of course, you need to use field experiments and not lab experiments there. Okay, great. Moving on. Let's go back to the organ donation study that you saw already. So this is interesting now because I'm going to add something extra here. So you already saw that here up to here, these are all countries which have opt-in option, and these are all countries which have opt-out option, which means in these countries, sorry, it's the other way around. In these I was right. So in these countries, you need to sign in if you want to give your organ for donation. So you need to tell them that, yes, I wish to give my organ. Here, you need to tell, no, I do not wish to donate my organ, basically. So here, more number of people sign up for organ donation. And this looks amazing. So why shouldn't all the countries implement these policies? Like, because there's a lot of waste organs when people pass away. Even when people do not, for religious reasons, believe that the organ shouldn't be donated, even when people believe that it should be donated, a lot of organs are going wasted, and a lot of people are in need of these organs. And why do we not donate? And why shouldn't government just put these policies in place? There are also some problems. So this is the people who signed up telling, yes, I will give my organ, basically. But this is not the number of people who actually donated the organs when they died. So 99.98% of Austrians are not donating their organs when they die. And this is the case because of two different reasons. Firstly, because when it's just presumed consent, the family of the dead person does not know if the person was actually willing to donate the organ or if the government just tricked them, basically. And these people are basically the ones who were actually motivated to donate the organ. These people need not necessarily be motivated to donate the organ. So the groups are extremely different. So just because they gave the consent doesn't mean they're actually going to donate the organ. And this step is also very important when it comes to policy recommendations. So, you shouldn't stop here. You should think more in the long term. So, okay, so now if people have signed up, will they actually donate the organ in the future? So this is something that you need to think about in your research as well. Whatever you do, think about it in long term. What other consequences will this have? Will it affect other people around? And will this effect stay for a long time, and so on? Okay, so let's look at one other interesting study before we sort of wrap up with some of my research. And this is on blood donation. Again, very similar to organ donation. So you want people to donate a lot of blood, but what the researchers are interested here is very different. So people donate a lot of blood because of altruistic reasons. So what they tried to do was that they incentivized people to donate blood, which means they told them that if you donate blood, we'll give you 1,000 rupees or 500 rupees, basically. So what happens is that earlier, if I donated blood, I did it because I was doing a social service. I felt very good about it. So after donating blood, I just felt like I did a good thing. But now, what happened? The number of donors went up. So a lot of people started donating blood. But the ones who are regularly donating blood, they stopped donating blood. So let's say I was donating blood every month. Now, after they started paying money for donating blood, I just stopped donating blood. But also the quality of blood samples went down. So the quality of blood samples means does the blood have alcohol? Does it have drug traces? And so on. And this quality went down. So what basically happens is that when people do some things due to altruistic reasons, and then you put a money to it, it just doesn't look so nice anymore. So now instead of feeling good about donating my blood, I feel like I'm selling my blood, which I don't want to do. So a lot of regular donors, therefore, would just drop out. So this is just a very good example of perverse incentives. So perverse incentives just means that when you give people incentives to do something, but it leads to something bad, it's called perverse incentives. To give you another example, so I cannot remember where exactly, but there was this archaeological place where they found bones of a lot of fossils. They found a lot of fossils, and they wanted to collect these bones from the sand. So what they told the people who lived there was that each time you find a bone, please come and give it to us. We'll pay you so much money. But what happened was, people, when they found a bone, instead of giving it and taking money, what they did was they broke it into multiple bits and gave one bit, got the money, gave the other bit and got the money. So what happens was, instead of getting full pieces, they got like really broken down pieces. So this is another example of perverse incentives. When you incentivize people in the wrong way, it could backfire. So both of these are examples of how certain policies could backfire. So the concept of warm glow. So warm glow basically means the feeling, the nice feeling that you get after you do something nice. So this could also be the case as people argue with voting in elections. So we vote because it's our duty and we want a good leader and so on. But if you're paid to vote, you basically start calculating. If let's say you're paid 20 rupees to vote in an election, you start calculating, is this 20 rupees worth taking a bus or a car and going all the way there and voting? It doesn't seem so nice anymore, and people stop voting. So this is very interesting. So when you incentivize people and assume that the number increases, it's possible that the number also decreases. Someone asked if presumed consent could be considered as a deceit. Yeah, people sometimes think of it that way as well. Okay, great. So let's move on. Okay, let's actually take a break again. Let's take another 5 minutes break, and I'll see you back in another 5 minutes then, and we'll quickly wrap up after that. Okay, so let's start again. Let's see like few more examples, and then we'll wrap up. So this is like the last part, and these are all research which are ongoing, but so we don't have the results yet, but you can still have a look at it and see how research comes up. So this is Switzerland. This entire colored region is Switzerland. And Switzerland is broken down into 4 language parts. So there's a part of Switzerland which speaks German. There's a part which speaks French. There's a part that speaks Italian and Romansh. And this is a very small region, so we sort of skipped it. And what we were interested in is, do people in these different regions have prejudices against each other? So do the French Swiss people have prejudices against the German Swiss people and so on? There's already a lot of stereotypes, and we are basically testing it in a very particular way. So what we did was, we gave the participants a passage which was exactly the same, but we told them that it's from either from one of these statements. So we told them it's from a Swiss German author, or from a Swiss French author, or from a Swiss Italian author. And the article was about the benefits of child labor. So it spoke about how child labor is actually very beneficial in certain scenarios, and why children should get work experience when they're young. And it makes a valid argument. In no way did we claim that child labor is good always. Of course, it's bad in a lot of ways. But we spoke about the benefits of child labor in this passage. And it's from an actual article. So after people read this, we observed a change in behavior. So we basically tried to see if they were willing to give charity to this cause to improve the employment of child labor. So instead of banning child labor, we could improve the working conditions. So instead of making kids work in really bad conditions, we basically ask them if they want to give money to charity. So we observed a change in behavior, and we also tried to find out their source credibility. So we tried to ask if they thought the author made sense, if the author seems credible, if the text seems credible, and so on. And we've just done the pilot research here, and we sort of anticipate that the German author would be considered the most credible by sort of everybody, because the German part of Switzerland and the German-speaking Swiss people are considered to be much more nerdy, or like more into research and things like that. And therefore we sort of anticipate these results, but of course we don't have the results yet. So this is one such research that you can do. Here, as you can see, the language regions are split by nature, so we cannot do anything there. But what we did was just manipulate this treatment and compare it with each other. Okay, so let's go on to another side note. There's already a lot of research where they did exactly the same, gave the same article, but two different authors to two different people. And one gives a female source and one talks about a male source. And sadly, female sources are considered to be much less reliable than male sources by readers, both female and male. And also later there was a after study questionnaire, and there the researchers found that people knew that female sources are considered less reliable than men, and women were asked this question: do you think you would be considered more reliable if you were a man? And some more than 80% of women said yes. And when men were asked, do you think a woman would be considered more reliable just if you change her gender? And most of the men agreed that that's the case. So it's a bias that people exhibit and are also aware of. Okay, so let's see if there's some questions. Yes, but not related. So let's move on. So this is another research. It's on immigrant perception. And this is something that I already spoke about during the Q&A session of one of the talks, but it was just like quick 1 minute thing. So let's look at it again. So people were given one of these two treatments. So it looks like a newspaper article which talks about a crime which was reported. And in one of the newspaper articles, we talk about a Swiss man, and in the other one, we talk about an immigrant. And this study was conducted in Switzerland as well. So we are conducting the study in Switzerland. And basically, after this is conducted, we ask if they think the criminal is a bad person, if they think the criminal is dishonest, and they are asked to rank them differently. And the one that we're most interested in is we ask them, how many years of prison sentence do you think this suspect should get? And they can give any number of years. And so we sort of look at these numbers, and with the pilot study, we sort of see that the immigrant gets much more prison sentence than a Swiss man. And the other question we're interested in is we ask them, do you think the suspect's crime should be registered in his, because it's a male, permanent criminal record that can be accessed by his future employers? So this basically asks if you think this person should be punished for his entire life. And this is a yes or no question. And we still don't know the results. So let's see what it looks like when it's done. So this is how you sort of come up with ideas. So you basically look at something and you usually get inspired and you try to ask some questions. So when you ask some questions, do you think, are women treated this way? Is this better than that? So whenever you come up with such questions, you try to formulate a nice experiment which can study this. So here we use this example to study if there's a discrimination between immigrants and Swiss people. So we specifically took a criminal case and then we study the difference. So, and then you try to find out if it's ethically right. You try to find out if there are some biases that could be present, and then basically you run the study. And this is sort of the process that we take when we are doing a normal experiment. A lot of people are telling the voice is breaking. I'm not sure why. Okay. So let's move on. So we still don't know the results here as well, but just from the pilot study, we see that people are more harsh towards the immigrants. So this is specifically for research in India. And okay, so let's take a lab experiment. So let's just quickly see what you need to know if you want to conduct a lab experiment in India, apart from everything that we have seen so far. We have already discussed some of these as well, but we just quickly have a recap of them as well. So firstly, of course, you need computers. And it's always nice to have a client-server structure where there's a server, and server is like the main computer that the experimenter uses. And there's a lot of clients, and all the clients should be connected to the server. Therefore, the experimenter can control all the computers from one computer. And it's important to have anonymity. As I showed you in the pictures, it's possible to have these blocks between computer to like not let people see each other's answers. But in a low budget thing, you could also have like cardboards, or I've conducted experiments in India where instead of having cardboards or any such structure, you just make them sit after, like you leave two computers in between and make them sit on this side and that side, basically to just make them sit far away from each other so they can't see each other's computer. And that works too. And also just make sure that you don't have a lot of people in each session. So each session is each experiment you conduct, like one group of experiment you conduct, and try not to have too many people. 20 or 30 is sort of the maximum I would recommend, because it already gets really hard to control people after that. So in case there's a small glitch or something, then it just gets really messy. So try not to have too many people at the same time. And so you can actually use a normal computer lab for behavioral experiments. You just need to make sure that people are sitting far away from each other so they don't see each other's computer. And talking about subject recruitment, you can recruit students however you want, or you can get subjects from outside. Just make sure that you get their consent. So before you start the experiment, always get the consent form signed. You can see a lot of examples of consent forms online, but just always get it signed. And also make sure that you compensate them well for their time. So if they're sitting for an hour, make sure you pay them for that. Try not to, it's not very ethical to make people sit for free for your research, but yeah, I mean, if they're willing to, then yes. And make sure you get ethical clearance before you start. So it could be from your university or wherever you need to get an ethical clearance, but make sure you get it, because when you want to publish it, it gets really hard if you don't have an ethical clearance. And just a side note, when you contact universities, if in case you're not conducting it in your own university, but you're conducting in a bunch of universities, and you need to talk to a lot of people, a lot of university principals and so on, try not to use the word experiments, because people get scared when you say you're going to experiment on their students. So you can just use the word based study, decision-making study, or whatever. Try not to use the word experiment. It hasn't worked great so far. Okay, the other thing is field and online experiments. So online experiment is much easier for recruitment because you can just publish it on Twitter, on Facebook, WhatsApp, wherever. And field experiment recruitment is much harder. You can either go out and do it yourself, or there are these recruitment agencies, as I spoke about already in another talk a few days back. And another thing is that ask them to have non-disclosure, which means tell them that they're not supposed to talk about it outside, so that they don't, ruin your rest of the subject pool. And promise that their name would never get out, because in lab experiments they can see that the identity is concealed, but in field experiments they don't know. And also make sure you compensate them well for their time. And one thing I forgot to tell here in anonymity of lab experiments is that the way we do it is, instead of making people sit in particular computers, in the beginning of the study we usually put lots. So let's say there are 20 people taking part, we put 20 numbers and we ask them to pick whatever number, and whichever number they get, we ask them to go sit in that particular computer. So this sort of randomizes them based on location as well. And again, for field experiment and online experiments, ethical clearance is extremely important. So get that before you actually start your study. Great, so wrapping up, let's just see what all we saw so far. So we learned about a lot of behavioral economic concepts. We saw how various framing effects, about various biases, heuristics, time inconsistency, risk preferences. We spoke about social preferences and so on. And we saw how these experimental methods work. So we had one rigorous class on how experimental methods are, what are the issues that you need to know, and so on. And we sort of put these two together to see a lot of examples on lab experiments and today on field experiments. So we also did some hands-on training on some lab experiments. You saw how ClassX works and so on. So now putting all of this together, the only thing that's left is for you to go out and run experiments, run a lot of behavioral science experiments. And as you know, most of these research is done in Western countries, and we need much more research in India. So it's all of our job to go and do more of that. So Thank you so much for your time. And that's all from me. If you have some questions, I'll be happy to answer. I think you'll have a quiz now. So maybe you could do that now.
Thank you, madam, for giving a great learning experience of natural and field experiments. Let me make a few announcements. Kindly see the chat box to get the quiz link and attendance form. Please submit your correct particulars for the certificate. Also, please see the link for the quiz, which is circulated in the chat box. As informed earlier, it is mandatory for getting a certificate. The quiz will remain active till 4 p.m. today. Only those participants. Before we conclude our session, it's time to propose a few words of thanks. On behalf of the FTP committee, it is my pleasure to express our deep sense of gratitude to each one of you who contributed to this faculty development program one way or other. We are grateful to the college management of Archdiocese of Changanasheri for all the support and guidance. We want to express our gratitude to our college principal, Dr. Jacob Matthew, for his timely presence, support, and sensible leadership. The program is being conducted in collaboration with Kerala State Higher Education Council. Thank you very much for the association. We had two excellent resource persons with us in the 5-day faculty development program, Dr. Ashish Kulkarni of Gokhale Institute of Political Science and Economics, and also in the first 2 days, and Junofy Anto Rozarina of University of Zurich in the last 3 days. Thank you very much for the fascinating insights and thought-provoking discussions. The Department of Economics, St. Berchmans College, is especially indebted to Professor Junofy